the Burn Bag Podcast. My name is Ryan Rosenthal, joined as always by Andre Ganuela. And today we have a fantastic episode with Gina Bennett, who is a renowned author and adjunct professor at Georgetown University, where she teaches ethics in intelligence. Now, Gina has written two fantastic books, the first one being National Security Mom, that was published in 2008, and a follow-on to that, which is America Needs a Timeout, which was published in 2019. Gina is a longtime CIA analyst, senior analytic service, and her career has covered a variety of counterterrorism issues, but most notably her analysis on Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. Gina, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really pleased to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I want to begin today's conversation by talking about your career, kind of how you came to join the CIA, what motivated you to join the agency, and kind of your professional story and personal motivations for going into such a fascinating career.
Sure. The funny thing is, it's kind of an accident, to be honest. When I was at the University of Virginia undergrad, I started off pre-med like a lot of other people, and got crushed by statistics and some of the more advanced science, and found a different path. I ended up going into economics and foreign affairs, and I just became fascinated with especially the history of the Middle East and the relationship between the rest of the world and the Middle East. And so when I graduated, I knew that I wanted to be involved in Middle East foreign policy. In fact, I think my dream job back then was working at the Middle East Institute, because I was young enough and naive enough not to understand you needed a PhD before you could work at a think tank. But I followed my father's advice, who always told me, Gina, nobody's going to know you're smart. You're just going to have to get in the door and prove it. So I took what amounts to a paid internship with the Department of State, where I was a clerk typist. So I literally I was a really good typist. I still type very quickly, typed and alphabetized, and had to take a test to show that I could do that quickly. And that's what I did for the summer right after I graduated. I was so happy to just have my foot in the door, as my dad always said. I was a GS4, which back then was about $13,000 a year in salary. So it wasn't much, but it was amazing to not be in school anymore. But while I was there for a couple of months, the woman who ran the office that I was in told me, she sat me down one day and she just said, Gina, I don't think this is where you belong. So I'm going to promote you and make you a GS5. And then you can have a permanent position and go get a job in intelligence. She's like, that's where I want you to get a job. I was like, okay. I was used to doing what I was told back then. So that's what I did. I found almost immediately a job as a terrorism watch officer. So this is in the State Department's Intelligence 24/7 Watch Center. The things you see on TV and all the TV shows, the 24/7 Watch Center. And there are, of course, a number of them all around DC in the executive branch. And this is the one at the Department of State. So my job was mainly watching, over 8-hour shifts, things that were happening in the world related to terrorism. Of course, it was a very different world because it was still the Cold War. But that's really how I got first tied into just even the concept of intelligence and terrorism.
So Gina, you were the author of that 1993 report that issued the warning basically about bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. Before that report, though, what were the real red alerts to you in the wake of the end of the Cold War and the fall of the USSR that indicated a potential threat from jihadi terrorism?
Yeah, no, these are really good questions. Number one, I feel very lucky to have entered the counterterrorism field at a time when we really still were in the Cold War. So there were Soviet troops in Afghanistan still, Reagan was president. And the reason I feel lucky is because, at that time, we were really battling Soviet Eastern Bloc inspired and sponsored terrorism around the globe. Leftist Marxist terrorists were conducting hundreds of attacks, in some cases a week. And it was, here I am, the young analyst being mentored by these experts in the field who really understood terrorism as an extremist outgrowth of, political conflict. So it was power competition at the time, between Marxism and capitalism and democracy and communism. And the terrorist activity and the terrorist attacks were short of the full out hot war that we were all trying to avoid. So, just coming in at a time where you can understand that terrorism is a symptom of some other kind of struggle, political struggle, or an outgrowth of it, I should say, that was really impressed on me in the very beginning. So by 1989, the Soviet troops started pulling out of Afghanistan, but they left behind Najibullah, a leader, a communist leader. And so most of the 7 parties of the Afghan resistance back then, the Mujahideen, as we called them, were still fighting that particular legacy, the Soviet legacy. The rest of us were paying attention to the fall of the wall and the Cold War ending. But in Afghanistan, they were still trying to purge themselves of this invasion from the Soviet Union. So, it was really watching from 89 to about 1992, when Najibullah, the Soviet installed leader, was assassinated, that we started to see people from other countries who had gone to Afghanistan to fight, to help the Mujahideen, on the same side as the United States, were coming back or trying to get back to their home countries. And most of them did. They made it back to their home countries, having served as volunteers in this war. But the thing that really stood out is because as an analyst, you're looking at the anomalies. You have to really understand the patterns, the normal, in order to understand the anomalies. And so some of the anomalies that started standing out was finding individuals from multiple different nationalities, and over 50 countries were represented in the Afghan war, showing up in other places and engaging or contributing to other conflicts in other countries, as far as the Philippines, eventually in the Balkans. But I mean, from the Philippines to Africa, we were seeing these individuals who had volunteered in Afghanistan. A lot of people, the liaison services that we were working with, so the intelligence services of these other countries that we were cooperating with or trying to assist, called them Arab Afghans because they dressed like Afghans, but they were, native Arabs. And that's just kind of an anomaly that sticks out. You're seeing this again. Everybody else is paying attention to democracy breaking out all over the world, and we're starting to see people leaving Afghanistan with all of this training and fighting experience and knowledge and network. Back then it was the Rolodex, and showing up in other places and helping other Islamic extremists, in particular organizations, be more effective in the type of insurgencies they were carrying out in their own home countries. So we called them originally the Wandering Mujahideen because there was no organization or, international organization that was sending them here and there. They were just migrating and finding their pathway there. So that was really one of the first red flags, was it stood out. And over time, we started learning more from, again, our colleagues in other intelligence and security services and foreign ministries around the world, who were increasingly finding these individuals enhance is probably too positive of a word, but deepen the violence and the clandestinity of, the secretiveness of these political dissidents, the Islamic extremist groups in multiple parts of the world, especially in North Africa. And, they were increasingly concerned at how they were really amping up the violence and the terrorism in particular. So it was, again, it's not like there was a lot of intelligence pointing to all of this. It was really just observing how unusual a pattern it was starting to become.
So Gina, at this time, I imagine there wasn't much focus on this kind of threat and the red alerts that you kind of just mentioned. But I'm curious if, what you kind of put out as far as analytical material, how was that received across the intelligence community? Were there like concerns in other areas of the IC or even within the CIA at that time? Or were these concerns not really received very well, given that their focus is elsewhere?
Well, it was rather mixed. I mean, on the one hand, it's not so much how it was received in the intelligence community that in the grand scheme of things mattered that much. It was, of course, the policymaking community, the operational community of the national security and foreign policy apparatus weren't paying attention to it. For them, again, it was dealing with all these newly independent countries that were, all over the world, but of course, particularly in the former Eastern Bloc, and just the whole global dynamics was in disarray, not to mention the long-standing concern about who owned the nuclear weapons, right? So, it's important to remember the level of anxiety that the world was feeling at that time. In the intelligence community, it's a human bias to believe that the next day is going to look like today. And so there was a lot of that. What I was saying in particular was a little, unusual. And we had just survived the Cold War and the fear of mutually assured destruction. We had known terrorist groups to be the outgrowths again of states, and the power competition between states. And so it was just strange to think of the possibility of an individual or group who had no organizational structure just moving around the world as any kind of real terrorist threat. I think there was, of course, also racism involved in this. So, I think within the intelligence community, there were quite a few people in counterterrorism who thought I was making a mountain out of a molehill. Some scoffing and brushing it off and maybe even laughing a bit. But at the same time, I also had colleagues who were in, I had one colleague in each of the main intelligence organizations back then. So NSA and FBI, our open source, FIBIS at the time, and even the Federal Aviation Administration. There was always one person in each of these organizations that was also seeing the same kind of phenomenon and hearing about it from their foreign counterparts. So what I did was in 1995, I started an interagency, an IC-wide working group. We called it the Mujahideen Interagency Working Group, for lack of anything more creative. And we would get together and kind of divide and conquer our analysis and produce working group level analytic pieces on different aspects of what we were seeing. So whether it was confrontation in the Philippines, trends we were seeing there, or trends we were seeing towards Bosnia, or Osama bin Laden, coming out as appearing to be this both financial patron as well as just charismatic leader. So once we started doing that, it made it a little harder to ignore, because it was multiple agencies now identifying the problem from different perspectives and warning about different implications for their own agency or department's mission. And that was much more powerful. So it started to get a little bit more attention. It just so happened that one of our meetings was scheduled for the day of the opium Sang bombing in Saudi Arabia, which it was in October, I think, of 95. And the individuals who were allegedly involved in that claimed to have been motivated by bin Laden. So whether or not that's true, I don't know. So hard back then to really know. But again, that was about the time that he became a little bit more of a known character because of that.
So when exactly did bin Laden, or in your reports, he was known as Abu Abdullah, when did he actually become prominent as a financier? Was it during the anti-Soviet conflict in Afghanistan? Was it before? When did he start becoming not necessarily a known entity to the US government, but really a known entity to the Mujahideen and the militants and so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two things. One, in hindsight, it became pretty clear that his financial largesse was more of a myth than a reality. So I think it's important to try to clarify that. There was a lot of rumor and about an innuendo about his money, but as we peeled that onion back, we increasingly didn't see the level of financing that that it seemed like back then. So there's that. But the other thing, though, is I think important to realize is while he was a Saudi citizen during the Afghan-Soviet War, he was engaged in legitimate assistance to the Afghan Mujahideen. And it wasn't the same as what we were doing in, the United States, but it was very important to have those volunteers coming from all over the world. I mean, that was a giving a validation and adding credibility, not just from a religious perspective, but from a global coalition perspective to the need to help the Afghans repel and push the Soviet troops out of their country, right? They had been invaded by a foreign military. So bin Laden and the Saudis in particular were part of a system of helping, facilitating the travel and sponsorship, in living situation for people who were coming from other countries to serve and help with the fight. So at what point he became illegitimate to the Saudi government, I'm not sure, but they certainly stripped him of his citizenship, I think in 1991 or 1992. It was either 91 or 92, I think. It's been so long, I'm sorry, I've forgotten the actual year. And, at that point, it became pretty clear he was on the, at odds with his own king. Much of that was over the US basing troops in Saudi Arabia to defend against Saddam Hussein's incursion into Kuwait and fear that he might continue to try to bully others in the neighborhood. So bin Laden was not happy about that. And he was very vocal about the fact that he felt that was a betrayal of the two holy places. And that didn't sit well with the king at the time. So,
I mean, when we talk about bin Laden's goals and his motivations during the anti-Soviet conflict and afterwards, was it primarily a sort of motivated by foreign occupation, or were there any other sorts of goals? For example, claiming power or establishing perhaps more of a state or something, or gaining power within Afghanistan? Were there any of those other goals present aside from thwarting foreign occupation by the Soviets and the Americans?
Yeah, well, so I'm not a psychologist, obviously. I haven't had the benefit of that training, and I very much respect psychologists dissecting the mind and ambition of Osama bin Laden. All I can offer you are my own perspective, my own observations and perspective on him. And there are a few things that stand out for me that may not be in the normal narrative you hear about him. One is that, as cliche as it may sound, he was an abandoned son who both feared and hated and probably admired and loved his father. And there was so much about the way he went about doing things that he did, whether it was the support he provided during the Afghan Soviet occupation under Saudi, legitimate cover, or when he went to Sudan and was trying to support Hassan al-Turabi, the National Islamic Front in Sudan, or when he moved on to Afghanistan. His behaviors and his almost hardwiring was to try to be as successful or even more successful than his own father had been as a kingmaker. So not someone who ever showed the signs of wanting to be in power. It really felt like the imprint of his father as the known Svengali, behind the scenes, the known kingmaker, the person who actually made it all work for the royal family. That seemed to be more what he wanted. So there's that. In so many ways, you're dealing with a little boy who was rejected and vilified by his own family, by his own father, and who, by all accounts, loved his mother, who he also felt was completely disrespected and abandoned. So there's that. Not that that excuses him for being a terrorist. I'm just saying that's, I think we have to deal with that fact. The other is he was very angry about US troops in Saudi Arabia. And I think believing that he and all of the Mujahideen not only forced the Soviet troops out of Afghanistan, but also were essential to the downfall of the whole Soviet empire. I mean, imagine you think that that was you, right? So to be so insulted as to be dismissed offhand as being capable of defending your own homeland from the potential of, invasion by Saddam Hussein was, just incredibly insulting. And I think there was an enormous amount of revenge that was part of what motivated bin Laden's hatred of the United States. I think it wraps up nice and neatly in a narrative of, US oppression of Muslims in the Middle East. But at the time, given that we hadn't invaded any country in the Middle East and had in fact, tried to defend Kuwait, it was a harder sell. So I think that was even more entrenched in Osama bin Laden when Hassan al-Turabi kicked him out of Sudan, because of course Turabi did it because he was feeling pressure from the United States and others to do so and to pull back from his ties with Islamic extremists and Islamist terrorist groups. So once again, I think, Martha Crenshaw, who I think is, one of the founders of the study of terrorism and counterterrorism, always told us that revenge is the number one motivation for terrorism. And I think that so much of bin Laden was about those two things, his father and revenge for being ridiculed and humiliated by the United States. And just being able to, again, use the narratives of the day to be able to sell it to so many other people.
Absolutely. So Gina, there appears to be this kind of myth around, and some of it is being, promoted by even some in Congress in the United States, that the U.S. supported bin Laden and his militants directly. But can we differentiate what is known as the, broader U.S. support for the Mujahideen with the actual support of bin Laden? And it did, I guess the question being, and for whatever you can actually say, if you can say, but is that a myth or is it reality? How do you assess it?
The United States was knee deep in supporting the Afghan Mujahideen, right? It's important to remember there were 7 parties of different political parties in the Afghan resistance to the Soviet Union once the king was gone. And those were the parties that we were supporting. The volunteer flood of Mujahideen was a side effect. It had a morale boosting and, if you want to call it an influential, like global influential campaign, just legitimizing the plight of the Afghan Mujahideen, right? And especially across the Muslim world, it was a call to support monetarily, whether or not you volunteered. There were so many non-governmental organizations and charities that you could support to help the Afghan people as they were trying to get rid of the Soviet Union. So anyone who thinks that the US government is capable of having its tentacles in all of that, we can't even figure out how to fund ourselves the coming year. So I just feel like they're going to be very disappointed when all of that history is unearthed and made unclassified, because it was hard enough to support the 7 parties that were organized.
So what exactly differentiated the bin Laden threat, the Al-Qaeda threat, from other non-state militant threats elsewhere around the world?
That's a really good question. So, I'm glad you asked that, because, back in the day, as I, was entering onto the scene, as I said before, there were, of course, a number of Islamist movements with very similar outlooks, not necessarily Salafi or jihadist in their core, but you can look back to the Gamat and the Egyptian Islamic Jihad, even in Egypt's experience, that were trying to purge their own government of what they still considered the inauthentic legacy of colonial rule. Frankly, that is exactly what birthed Al-Qaeda and ISIS and all of these extremist groups, is still purging these countries, these nations, populations of inauthentic government structures and elites who were brought in by, former colonial powers. So the only thing in my mind that really stood out that is different from what bin Laden, and it wasn't immediate. Bin Laden initially thought support individual groups like this. Over time, it was clear that the takeaway from the Afghan experience was, when we bring ourselves together, when we bind together, we are more powerful together than we are separately in each of these countries. So while initially there was a facilitation pipeline that went, to Afghanistan and then leaving Afghanistan, especially after Najibullah fell in 1992, to get to other countries, to rejoin extremist groups or join extremist groups for the first time that were trying to depose their own national leaders, bin Laden started to see, if we combine ourselves, or at least some of us combine ourselves, thus the base, Al-Qaeda, we can be more powerful in this joint endeavor of purging that legacy of colonial, inauthentic governance across the entire Muslim world. Again, you infuse that with the rejection by the king in 1991 or 92, whenever that was, I've forgotten, and then ultimately being kicked out by Tarabi in 1996, and this intense hatred and desire for revenge against the United States. You can see how the narrative of it's the United States behind all of these countries, it's the United States and Israel and the West behind all of these countries, and that's why we're not making progress. Now, that narrative did not really sell. It really didn't. Not until, really not until after we invaded Iraq in 2003, three. See, I'm all lost on my time. I date everything by the birth of my kids, not so much when events in the world actually happen. So, it was only then when what he said, 10 years earlier started to look very prescient. And that really added to his stature and credibility and the legitimacy of the rest of the things that he was saying. So it just, that's when we began to see now, not just one Al-Qaeda, but now we have Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And then next thing you know, we have Al-Qaedas everywhere, and then ISIS everywhere. So the reason I think it's an important question is because on the one hand, well, he made very popular this global, connectivity of their enemy and their cause. Those causes are still very much rooted in local issues and local grievances that, if disconnected from the global, have a vast diversity of solutions in front of them. That I think we have largely missed out on in the past 20 years, having focused very much on the global tip.
So Gina, we're kind of fast approaching 9/11, but before we get there, I want to talk about the last decade of the pre-9/11 era. Did the styles of attacks, given the rise of these Islamic extremist movements around the world, did the styles of attacks in the 90s change? Did we see new tactics and techniques emerge? And with that, what is bin Laden's kind of connection, if any, to the World Trade Center bombing in 1993, which is probably the first time many Americans probably came to hear about this massive threat that was coming to a head?
Yeah. So, in terms of tactics, terrorism doesn't really have to innovate too much. It just tweaks as it goes along. And I think Martha Crenshaw taught us that too. She's amazing. So, the thing with the tactics is I don't really remember that the 1990s were that different in terms of the actual tactics. You saw for a little while a brief, almost a reduction in the number of airline attacks after the 1988 Pan Am 103 bombing by Libya was so well deconstructed by the FBI and Scotland Yard that we were able to identify the exact little, device that had been the cause of the attack and who had ordered it, Gaddafi and his two intel guys who were involved in it. And I think that put a little bit of a chill in state-sponsored terrorism for a while because, being able to be found out, it's not so much the techniques as it is tradecraft. So I think what you see through the 1990s, especially towards the end of it, is the beginning of understanding the role of technology, but it really hadn't, we are not seeing the hallmarks of that until you get almost into the 2010s, and beyond, where people are able to use technology and the access to information to reduce the number of, say, surveillance, runs they have to do, which reduces your likelihood of being caught. That is starting to change terrorism a lot more. But in the 90s, the car bombings, sometimes suicide, sometimes not. I don't really feel like there was that much of a change. In terms of 1993, I think the jury is still very much out on that. I personally was convinced it was back during that time frame. I was a minority for sure who believed that, but I have also learned over the years is you should never believe what you think, and you always change. When you look back, you'll change your mind about what you used to think as well. So never believe what you think. I mean, just never adhere so much to your thought that you aren't willing to challenge it and have it, disproven. And the more and more I look back at 9/11 and 1993 and the role of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in both of these, and understanding that in 1993, it is quite possible that bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed had not actually met, and that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was not a member of Al Qaeda when 9/11 occurred. I mean, you could say that 9/11 was not an Al Qaeda attack in that sense. It was a Khalid Sheikh Mohammed attack. So here you have KSM involved in both of these. So it's hard, especially when even in 2001, he had not sworn his oath to Osama bin Laden. So what does that mean for 1993? Facilitated, enabled, supported in theory, I think absolutely, but masterminded, directed, conceived by, no, I don't think so.
So I guess then why were we sort of caught so off guard on 9/11 when we had seen, I guess, jihadi links to the 1993 World Trade Center bombings, the USS Cole bombing in 2000, and then the Kenya embassy bombing in 1998. Why did we not take this seriously or believe that bin Laden and Al Qaeda could launch an attack within the US?
Well, there are a couple of reasons for that. And I think it's, but mainly I really feel like it's important for people to realize that no matter how much we collect intelligence in the world, no matter how much we try to understand ahead of time what's happening, having that sort of actionable, specific type of information to prevent an attack is a near impossibility. It has happened on a couple of occasions. I mean, I've been doing this for 33 years. So while at the time we weren't very much aware and had been warning the president and others that we were tracking what we believed was a fairly major complex attack being planned and directed from Afghanistan, from the Al Qaeda circles. It was extremely difficult for us to understand what it was going to be. you know, you just don't collect that kind of intelligence. I mean, terrorist groups by their nature have to be as secretive as possible in order to survive. So they don't typically go around telling everyone what they're doing. They won't last long if they do. So it's difficult to know ahead of time. Now, the little nuggets that we did strongly suggested to us that it was, again, a complicated, very, high level, anticipated to have extremely high impact, which meant, they were anticipating that the United States would likely invade Afghanistan as a response. It was also something that, because bin Laden, this was judgment analysis, not intel, because bin Laden had been so roundly criticized for killing so many Muslims and Africans in the African embassy bombings, and because the Cole attack didn't succeed in sinking the ship, which was the plan, that he needed to kill Americans. And so it was analytic judgment that that attack was going to be in the United States. But again, what do we've told the president, but we don't know what it's going to be. So what do you do? What do you do with that? I mean, like, honestly, what do you do with that as a president? If you hear of a plan to attack a school, and you're the principal, you can shut the school down and send everybody home. But at what point do you have to let the kids come back to school, right? So it's without that actionable, tangible, very tactical information to stop an attack, there's not a lot you can really do or expect someone to do ahead of time. So I think that's important. The other thing is, I'll be honest with you, at the time, of course, everyone afterwards thought CIA and FBI were at odds with each other. We weren't at odds with each other. We had very different operating directives. We performed vastly different roles for the safety and security of the American people. So, while the FBI is law enforcement, it was, especially then, extremely decentralized. And you wanted it that way. You didn't want Big Brother in Washington, D.C. watching everything, right? So the FBI field offices were working their cases in the field, locally, in context at the time. And it wasn't built as a system where that reporting made it back to the FBI headquarters, and then FBI headquarters shared it with the rest of the intelligence community. So we did not know that there were individuals in the United States who were learning to fly but not land. We didn't learn any of this. So, it's not somebody's fault. That was the system we were in at that time. Now that has since been changed quite a bit. But, before the attack in 9/11 in 2001, the Bureau did not believe it had any Al-Qaeda members in the United States. It just didn't see any evidence of that. And that's a very difficult thing, for the CIA to say, well, we think there are here. And the FBI, whose territory is the United States, says they're not. If you're the president, who are you going to believe, right? So I think I don't want to retread this for the sake of retreading it, but I think what's important is to understand that right now, people are making arguments that seem unbelievable. Analysts are seeing signs of things that seem unfathomable and run against every department and agency's mission and sense of whatever, and certainly are incongruent with what the president or any of us want at any given time. And we're probably dismissing a lot of that too. And some of it is going to be right. It's just the way of the world.
So Gina, I want to talk about the days leading up to and the actual day of September 11th, 2001. Andre and I were 4 and 5 years old at that time. So we have very few memories of that, but of course it impacted those, and families, friends, and people around. I think it impacted every American, certainly. And so, but you had a very unique experience because you were serving at CIA at the time. And so I think it'd be very useful for our audience to get an understanding of what it was like for you as a CIA analyst and the days leading up to and on 9/11.
Yeah. So the days leading up to 9/11, I was actually pregnant at the time with my 4th child. It was really early on in my pregnancy. So a lot of what I remember is not feeling well at work. But a couple of days before 9/11, Al-Qaeda managed to assassinate Ahmed Shah Massoud, who had been one of the leaders of the seven parties during the Afghan-Soviet War. He was the leader of the Northern Alliance, as we called it, the Northern Alliance that was still fighting the Taliban rule in Kabul. So it was shocking that he was assassinated. I mean, this is a man who had survived a lot of attempts against his life. The reason it was extremely worrisome for us was because he was really our ally still in trying to understand what was happening in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. So our window into, because of course we had no embassy, we didn't have the ability to have the kind of intelligence collection that you would want at the time. So that threw a lot into disarray. And my friend and I, we both worked in counterterrorism center, we also carpooled. And so we were carpooling to work on 9/11, which, everyone on the Eastern Seaboard will tell you was just a beautiful day, gorgeous, crisp, cool, blue sky, unbelievable day. And we didn't want to go to work. It's like one of those days was like, oh, I wish I could just not go to work. But all we were talking about the whole drive was Ahmed Shah Massoud and what does this mean? And, how did Al-Qaeda do it? And really just what is it? What are the implications across the board? So when the first thing you do in the morning in this kind of world is catch up on the 8 hours that occurred while you were home asleep. Most of us are, we're terrorism analysts, right? So we are tracking specific groups. We are trying to uncover plotting and prevent attacks. So, we're all going about our work, doing our little piece of the world or the group or whatever it is we're following. When we heard from our FAA counterpart, again, this is the predecessor to the TSA, who was in the counterterrorist center, yell out, a plane just hit the North Tower, I think it was the first one. And we were, contrary to the movies, there weren't a bunch of movie screens or anything like that. There's no TVs anywhere for us to watch this. So we were waiting to hear more. We thought, okay, is this like a commuter, one of those little planes that just had an unbelievably horrible mechanical fault, whatever. That's kind of what we were trying to think that it was. But, within a few minutes, we weren't really getting any clarity. So a handful of us, and there were only about 30 of us back then, we went into a side office. Only the managers had offices. So we went into this manager's office and we turned on the television. And so we saw the smoke in the hole and it looked far too large to be a commuter plane. And while we were watching that, trying to wrap our brains around that, we saw, of course, the other plane hit the South Tower. And that's when, every single one of us knew that was a terrorist attack. This is Al-Qaeda. No one even told us what to do or anything. We just ended up, I don't even remember. I just remember looking at my colleague and then going back to my desk and being at my desk and furiously trying to find out what's coming next. Because I think what's important, also to realize is we had no reason to think that it was going to be just one day or just this set of attacks. Al-Qaeda had a lot of plots, most of them aspirational, but we had no way of knowing which ones were aspirational and which ones were real. In the hopper, always. And so we had to track down every single one, however flaky some of them might have been, just to figure out what was coming next. And even after the planes were grounded, by 4:00 in the afternoon, we still, didn't think it was over. And I think most Americans look back at 9/11 and they see a day and they remember a day. For us, we remember about 2.5 years, or even longer before we felt like we had run to ground all of those attacks that Al-Qaeda members had conceptualized, passed along, aspired to. I'm not even sure we're done, to be honest. So I think, the day was obviously extremely chaotic, but like anybody and, any first responder, anybody in any kind of emergency role, you just focus, and there was no time for feeling or getting upset or getting angry or being scared. There was no time for any of that. And for the most part, I don't think any of us, we're professionals. We're accustomed to this. We're accustomed to being the people who aren't allowed to panic. And so you just do your work, you focus, you zero in, and, the hours run into days, days run into weeks before you realize, that it's even happened. And I do remember, like, I don't know, at some point during the day, George Tenet, who was the director of the CIA at the time, ordered the building to be evacuated. All the federal buildings were being evacuated, except for the counterterrorist center. So, which we were grateful for, because we're like, okay, we're just going to stay here. I hope nobody comes and tries to peel us out, because then we're going to have to fight the security forces, the security officers, because we're not leaving. We have work to do. So anyway, as many of my colleagues were probably leaving to go pick up their kids and do everything else because the schools were all letting out, quite a few of them came down to the counterterrorist center to volunteer. And in many cases, some of those faces I'll never forget were people who, months before thought we were kind of hyping the terrorist threat. So it was really meaningful to see people like that come down and say, I don't care if this building is bombed, I want to help. So yeah, it was I'm sure you've heard, it was a day of horror and fear and tragedy. And it was also a day that brought out the best in a lot of people. I think that's just what intensity does to human beings.
So when we look at the jihadi terrorist threat since 9/11, we talked a bit about bin Laden's sort of position in the 1990s with regards to Al-Qaeda, but we've seen the emergence of other terrorist groups. And I wanted to know, was Al-Qaeda sort of centralized or decentralized as an organization in the aftermath of 9/11? Like, was bin Laden more of a mythic figure, or was he more of a, hands-on type of leader? Because we often talk about, I think I remember reading a book by General Stanley McChrystal about al-Zarqawi, who led Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and sort of the idea that he became a mythic figure after his death. He became more powerful after dying, and this aura of his leadership was what sort of motivated terrorists with regards to Al-Qaeda in Iraq and ISIS. So was bin Laden mythical? Was he more of a practical, hands-on leader? And has sort of jihadi terrorism grown more decentralized, or was it always decentralized?
Yeah, so we've this is a common debate, of course, among terrorism experts as well. I have a very different take on this, so I'll be honest with you. It's not commonplace, but number one, it's not either or, and I think that's our very binary brains wanting it to be either or, and it wasn't for bin Laden. I think bin Laden lived a life of both where he wanted to be in charge and other times where he very deliberately was hands off. Again, I think he was emulating both his father's style as well as, to some degree, the style of the prophet as he understood it. So he did both, and by design and for effect. So I think Al-Qaeda organizationally is very similar. It has adapted to when it can be centralized very nicely, and it has luckily had the foresight and ability to adapt to when it needed to be decentralized. Remember, Al-Qaeda knew probably 2 years in advance that they were going to have to leave Afghanistan, or at least that there was the threat that they were going to have to. So being able to set up a decentralized structure in order to continue to communicate and make decisions was something that they had the advantage of knowing ahead of time. All that being said, I have found this conversation about the debate over the leader and how much that leader is the imprint of the fight of the organization, whether it's a legitimate revolution, insurgency, or terrorist group, versus the root causes of these conflicts, has been a debate constantly in the community that I've lived in for over 30 years. And when I first joined as one of few women involved in counterterrorism back then, it was very clear that discussing root causes as an issue to address was considered being apologetic for terrorism. It was considered weak and not what you do, just not what you do. So I still see that legacy in the way we think about leaders, the real correlation between leadership and strength of organizations. Whereas I have to tell you, as a woman, it's still about root causes. You could take away every charismatic leader. You could have horrible leaders. It doesn't matter, in my opinion. It's the root causes. If the root causes are still there, if they're being aggravated, if they're being addressed, those are the big factors in whether or not the group lives on.
So Gina, I want to begin to round out today's conversation by talking about you being a national security mom. And you, of course, have written 2 great books on the subject. And you just mentioned how, being, of course, a woman rising to the intelligence community can be challenging in many instances. And so how has diversity played into national security in your career? And have there been improvements in bringing in voices from women, from people of color, for people of color? Is there kind of a movement towards bringing in these differing perspectives? And then on top of that, I do want to also get your perspective on how motherhood has influenced your career in national security, particularly your perspectives.
Okay, big set of big questions there. I'm not sure which order to take them in, but I will tell you, just as a mother, the motherhood piece, I use more skills from being a mother than skills given to me or trained into me by the agency on a daily basis. And I think when it comes to security, international security, national security, as a mom, there are 2 things that color how I see security, national security, and the lack of it that I can't get past anymore. And I don't think there's any movement towards seeing it this way. One is, as a mother, I am very long-term in my thinking, right? And I accept, as a mother of 5 children, an enormous amount of chaos and ambiguity and conflict, because my children are now, 16 to 28. When they were little, it was a nightmare. And as a mom, you have a very short period of time that you can influence and help your child develop into whoever he or she is going to be, that you hope is going to be a positive force in the world, right? You can't control it. You cannot control it. And you can't control them. And there are going to be periods where they're little shits. They are awful. And you don't like them. But you have to love them, and you do, and you're patient, and you wait. And you shape in whatever way you can, however distantly you might have to do that. And then there's a period of time when they start moving on and they find other sources of influence, other sources of love and joy in their lives, other sources of heartache. Can't control it, can't change it, can't experience it for them, right? That is what I think of when I think of power. To me, physical power is not definitive. I can punch you in the face. That is not going to mean you're going to change your mind and agree with me. Quite the opposite. For millennia, we have been sold this idea that physical power, physical integrity of our borders, physical might, the ability to not be destroyed physically by a military or bombs or nuclear warheads, is what makes us secure. And it's not. It's what makes us insecure, because we rest ourselves on that. And so we define our security by the absence of threat. Well, threat is everywhere. So I feel like we're constantly insecure, because in my mind, all I am doing is raising children to be secure in who they are without me. So when I think of our national security, I think of it in terms of the integrity of who we are as a government, as a nation, as a people. And as long as, even if we serve, even if we have a nuclear holocaust, I don't think the next day Americans are going to be like, oh, okay, well, I guess I'll join a caliphate, or I guess I'll be communist. No, we're going to be destroyed, terrified, scared, but we're going to fight to be who we are. It comes back to my comment about authenticity. I mean, ultimately, we're going to continue to want to be who we say we are, not who somebody else says we are. So I guess I just have enormously more patience because of that. When people look at what has happened in Afghanistan, I don't see it the same way as everyone. Everyone, people who are saying, it was all for nothing. No, those people were trying to come to the United States. 20 some years ago, that wasn't the case. Anyone who's in Afghanistan who is rejecting the Taliban now, or ISIS, or whatever's next, they're going to make the change. It took this country 200 years to have women. Half the population wasn't allowed to even be a citizen. It doesn't happen overnight. Just like taking my baby and turning them into a 40-year-old functioning adult does not happen overnight. So I think, letting go of this arrogance that we think we're going to see the results of our work in our own lifetime and recognize that we're not, to have the humility to recognize that we're not. And influence is so infinitely more enduring and powerful because it becomes a shared experience, becomes a shared set of values. And when that happens, that lasts. Threat and violence don't. So that concept of security, I think, again, coming from perspective as a woman and perspective as a mother, I just don't think exists in our national security apparatus. It doesn't exist in our politics. It just isn't part of our daily conversation here. Apart from, Abraham Lincoln saying it, 180 years ago, we just don't see it. And I think that's, for me, that's a lot of the reason why I wrote the National Security Mom books. I wanted, first of all, I wanted girls and women to understand that they have the innate skills and talents to be extremely important and impactful in national security and international security, not because they're peace loving, but because they have a different way of looking at the world. We do, as girls and women, we have very much a different way of looking at the world because we don't know security as the absence of threat. We are threatened all the time. I mean, 1 in 3 women in this country is raped. 1 in 2 is probably sexually assaulted. We don't know a life of no fear or no threat for our physical integrity, but we're resilient. And as long as we maintain the character of who we are and we decide what we believe and think, then we're strong and independent. And I think if the nation looked at its own security that way, all the threats in the world would be irrelevant. And if you want to destroy terrorism, that's the way to destroy it. You make it irrelevant. The only thing you have to do is not be afraid of it.
In our last minute or so, I mean, you mentioned, being a woman and bringing in those different perspectives. And I feel like on the podcast, with all due respect to our previous guests, we've had a big white wall of men who've been our guests or who've had these long careers in the IC and national security. Can you tell us a bit more about Girl Security, an organization that you're on the board for? And can you just sort of give us an idea, like, is the intelligence community, is the national security apparatus, is there a trend towards more diversity, or do we still have a long way to go?
No, there's definitely a trend toward more diversity. I mean, I feel like the CIA has always, okay, always is not a good word because I've only been there for 30 years, but there is a value to diversity that is inherent in the success of the organization, right? We are global in our work. So we need global understanding, and you can best get that through an incredibly diverse set of people. That doesn't mean you have to be from a certain country. Maybe you've lived there for 10 years or so. But the concept of diversity of thinking and experience is hugely important for the success of the intelligence community and for the national security apparatus. That said, of course, it has taken a really long time to move away from the very white male dominated, frankly, white male Christian dominated national security apparatus. After all, that is what our founding fathers were, and that's what they wrote into the Constitution. So just that anchor. I'm a big fan of Daniel Kahneman and Thinking Fast and Slow and understanding your anchor bias. So it's taken a long time. It is deliberate though, and I think it is vastly different than when I first started, vastly different. And not even just in terms of the normal buckets of diversity you think about, but also in terms of how people, cognition, people have very different ways of thinking. And some people have certain skills and difficulties and challenges, and others have different skills and difficulties and challenges. We all have both. And I think realizing that when you have an obstacle or a challenge to your cognition, that does not make you less of a contribution. And understanding how to empower all of the different ways people think and why they think it, and why and frankly how they feel and why they feel it, is very powerful for solving world problems. So I think that's really important. That being said, it's still a system. It's still a default set of theories and concepts that appear to have been proven in factual history over millennia again, but certainly thousands of years since, Westphalia, that we all are trying to contribute to. So when you're someone like me who challenges that, you just don't get anywhere. When you're on the outside saying, hey, it's only this way because it has been recorded to be this way. And oh, by the way, that record keeping has been 99.95% male record keeping. So, and I'm not accusing men or, blaming them. It just is a fact. Because it has been recorded this way doesn't mean it actually all happened that way. And certainly for the women whose lives were, if at all recorded, were recorded through the perception of men, it didn't happen that way. It still doesn't happen that way. So it's very hard, even if you are in a place that accepts, embraces, encourages diversity, and is open to the challenge of different ways of thinking and different solutions to problems. It's still within a system that was created by one set of people. So it's breaking that default is extremely difficult.
With that, Gina, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. Truly a fantastic conversation. We covered a lot. And I know that our listeners will feel a bit better and sleep better knowing that you and those like you are doing the very difficult work of protecting this country. So, Gina, thank you for a great conversation. And thank you, of course, for your service.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really appreciated it. And I'm so excited that my dog didn't snore at all while we were talking.